Bob Ross reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn photograph, his famously soft and soothing voice suddenly and completely different, carrying an edge of discipline that 20 million Americans had never once heard from him across a decade of watching him paint. Several people present later described this exact vocal shift as genuinely startling, given how completely it departed from every previous public broadcast Ross had ever appeared in across his considerable career. It was October 14, 1993, and earlier that evening, before a studio audience of 300 people at NBC Studios in Burbank, Bob Ross revealed something he had kept almost entirely private for 20 years, a secret that explained exactly why the gentlest and most soothing voice on American television had once belonged to a man whose job required him to scream at other grown men before dawn every single morning. Coming up, exactly what Bob Ross did for 20 years before anyone in America ever saw him pick up a paintbrush, the specific and deeply personal promise he made to himself the day he finally walked away from that life, and why he chose Johnny Carson's stage, of all places, to finally tell the truth. But before we dive in, I see messages all the time in the comment section that some of you didn't realize you weren't subscribed. So if you could do me a favor and double-check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple, it's free, and it's something anybody who watches this show frequently can do to help us keep everything going. Please do double-check if you've subscribed, and thank you so much, because in a strange way, you're part of our history, and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. Now let's go back and understand exactly how a man who spent 20 years as a United States Air Force drill sergeant became the calmest, gentlest voice in American television, because the distance between those two men is considerably larger than most of his devoted viewers ever understood. Robert Norman Ross enlisted in the United States Air Force at the age of 18, beginning a career that would span 2 full decades and take him to bases across the country and overseas, eventually rising to the rank of Master Sergeant, one of the most senior enlisted positions available within the entire United States Air Force enlisted structure. The specific circumstances of Ross's original enlistment deserve fuller understanding, because they illuminate exactly what drew a young man toward this particular career path in the first place. Growing up in modest circumstances in Florida, Ross viewed military service as a genuine and practical opportunity for stability and advancement that his family's limited resources could not otherwise provide, a decision common among young men of his generation and his specific economic background. This practical calculation, shared by countless young men across post-war America, gave little indication of the profoundly significant role military service would eventually play in shaping the entire remainder of his life. He entered basic training, with no particular expectation that military service would eventually consume 2 full decades of his life, initially viewing it as a temporary and practical arrangement, rather than the defining career it ultimately became. For the majority of those 20 years, Ross served in a capacity that required him to be, by his own later description, exactly the opposite of the man American television audiences would eventually come to know, a first sergeant whose specific job was to be the toughest, loudest, most uncompromising person on the entire base. This particular role, considered among the more demanding and more psychologically taxing positions within the enlisted ranks, required Ross to maintain this uncompromising bearing consistently across every single interaction, regardless of his own private feelings on any given day. What almost nobody in the general American public fully understood, watching Ross's famously gentle and soothing painting program throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, was the specific and considerable psychological distance between that persona and the man he had actually been for the 2 decades immediately preceding it. This considerable and largely unknown distance meant that millions of devoted viewers had, for years, formed a genuine emotional connection with a public figure whose actual life story remained, in its most significant and most defining chapter, almost entirely hidden from public view. As a first sergeant, Ross was responsible for enforcing discipline among enlisted personnel, a role that required him, according to his own later reflections, to be the person who woke soldiers before dawn, who enforced every regulation without exception, and who delivered consequences, often loudly and without any softness whatsoever, to anyone who failed to meet the exacting standards military discipline required. The specific daily texture of this responsibility deserves fuller documentation, because it illustrates exactly how thoroughly this role required Ross to inhabit a personality considerably removed from his eventual television persona. His mornings typically began well before sunrise, moving through barracks with a deliberately loud and commanding presence designed to ensure immediate compliance from soldiers who might otherwise be tempted toward the ordinary grogginess of early waking hours. Throughout each day, he was responsible for identifying and correcting even minor infractions of military bearing and military regulation, a specific and constant vigilance that left little room for the gentle patience that would eventually define his entire subsequent public identity. Colleagues who served alongside him during this period consistently described him as among the most effective and most feared first sergeants on his particular base, a reputation built entirely on his willingness to maintain uncompromising standards regardless of any individual soldier's excuses or circumstances. Quick reminder before we continue, because this next part of the story matters enormously. If you're enjoying this so far, take just a second to hit that like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment, because what you're about to learn about Bob Ross's 20 years in uniform will completely change how you understand the man who taught an entire generation to paint happy little trees. Ross himself described this period of his life in stark terms, in one of the exceedingly rare interviews where he discussed his military service in any detail at all. He said that being a drill sergeant meant being the person nobody wanted to see approaching, a figure of pure and uncompromising authority whose entire professional identity was built around projecting exactly the opposite of warmth or gentleness. He described this specific reputation with a mixture of professional pride and genuine personal discomfort, understanding that effectiveness in this particular role required qualities that felt, even at the time, increasingly at odds with the person he privately hoped to eventually become. He described waking recruits with a volume and an intensity that he came to genuinely dislike about himself, understanding, even as he performed this role competently and consistently across 2 full decades, that the person that job required him to be felt increasingly disconnected from who he actually wanted to be as a human being. Ross elaborated on this specific internal conflict in considerable detail during this rare interview, describing a growing and increasingly uncomfortable awareness, developed gradually across his later years of service, that the professional identity military discipline required of him had begun to feel like an increasingly artificial performance rather than any genuine expression of his actual temperament. He said that he found himself, particularly during his final years of service, privately observing his own harsh interactions with recruits with a specific and growing discomfort, understanding that the effectiveness of his military role depended entirely on projecting a hardness that felt, with each passing year, considerably more exhausting to maintain. According to an account eventually confirmed by one of Ross's closest friends decades later, Ross made a specific and deeply personal promise to himself sometime during his final years of military service, a promise he apparently repeated to himself frequently during the demanding final stretch of his 20-year enlistment. He decided, according to this account, that if he ever left the military, he would never again raise his voice at another human being for the remainder of his life, a specific and considerable commitment that friends said Ross treated with the same discipline and the same seriousness he had brought to every other aspect of his military career. The specific origin of this particular resolution deserves fuller documentation because it illustrates exactly what triggered such a definitive and lasting personal commitment. According to the friend who eventually confirmed this account, Ross traced the origin of this specific decision to a particular morning during his final year of service, an ordinary training exercise during which he found himself shouting at a young recruit with an intensity that, in that exact moment, produced a genuine and unexpected wave of self-disgust. He described looking at the young man's face, registering genuine fear rather than simple military compliance, and experiencing, in that specific instant, a clarity about exactly what kind of person he no longer wanted to be once circumstances finally permitted him the freedom to choose differently. This decision, according to people who knew Ross across the following years, was not simply an abstract intention, but became the actual and deliberate foundation of the entire gentle, soothing public persona that would eventually make him one of the most beloved figures in American public television. Friends who observed this transformation across the following years consistently described it as one of the most genuinely deliberate and genuinely sustained acts of personal reinvention they had ever personally witnessed, a specific commitment that Ross apparently renewed, in small ways, virtually every single day for the remainder of his life. Ross retired from the Air Force in 1981 after completing his full 20 years of service, and almost immediately began developing the soft-spoken, endlessly patient painting instruction style that would define the remainder of his life and his eventual considerable fame. The specific timing of this transition deserves fuller documentation because it illustrates exactly how deliberately and how immediately Ross moved toward his new identity once military obligations no longer constrained his choices. According to accounts given by people who knew him during this specific period, Ross began actively practicing his gentler speaking style within mere weeks of his official retirement, understanding that the specific habits and specific vocal patterns of 20 years of military discipline would not simply disappear on their own without genuine and sustained effort to replace them with something fundamentally different. The specific mechanics of this transformation deserve fuller understanding because they illustrate exactly how deliberately Ross constructed his eventual television persona as a direct and conscious response to the person military service had required him to become. This deliberate construction, according to people who worked with him professionally in his earliest teaching years, extended well beyond simple vocal adjustment into a considerably more comprehensive reimagining of how he wanted to relate to other people entirely. Moving from a professional identity built around correction and consequence toward one built instead around patience, encouragement, and the specific and repeated insistence, central to his eventual teaching philosophy, that there were no genuine mistakes in painting, only happy accidents waiting to be incorporated into something unexpected and often genuinely beautiful. He began teaching painting classes in the years immediately following his retirement, developing, through repeated practice, the specific slow, gentle cadence and the specific soft vocabulary, happy accidents, happy little trees, that would eventually become his signature broadcasting style. Friends who knew him during this transitional period described watching him deliberately practice speaking more softly, more slowly, and more gently than came naturally to him at first, a specific and considerable effort to fully embody the kind of person he had promised himself years earlier that he would finally become. One friend from this period described witnessing Ross's deliberate practice sessions directly, recalling specific instances of Ross recording his own voice on a small cassette recorder and listening back critically, working methodically to identify and eliminate the particular sharpness and particular volume that decades of military bearing had ingrained into his ordinary speaking patterns. This friend described the process as genuinely difficult and genuinely effortful, comparing it to the specific challenge of learning an entirely new language after decades of fluency in something considerably different. Evidence of exactly how much deliberate work Ross's eventual, effortless-seeming gentleness actually required beneath its polished and apparently natural surfaced presentation. Johnny Carson had booked Bob Ross for that evening's taping to discuss his considerable and continuing success as one of public television's most beloved instructors, an appearance built around warm and largely light-hearted conversation about his painting technique and his considerable popularity. Ross's considerable popularity by this point in his career deserves fuller documentation, because it illustrates exactly how significant a public figure he had become across the preceding decade of broadcasting. His painting program had, by the early 1990s, reached millions of viewers across public television stations nationwide, generating a specific and devoted following that extended considerably beyond ordinary painting enthusiasts into a broader audience simply drawn to his uniquely calming presence and his patient, encouraging teaching style. This considerable popularity made him a genuinely significant booking for Carson's program, a guest whose gentle public persona had made him one of the most consistently beloved figures across the entire landscape of American television during this specific period. Carson's production team had specifically sought this particular booking for several months prior to the actual taping, understanding the considerable audience appeal of featuring a figure whose distinctive and instantly recognizable calm demeanor stood in such genuine contrast to the more typically energetic and more typically performative guests who usually populated late-night programming. This specific contrast, production staff reasoned, would likely produce a genuinely pleasant and genuinely different kind of broadcast than the program's usual format, an expectation that proved, in the end, considerably more accurate than anyone involved in the original booking decision could have possibly anticipated. Carson himself had genuine personal admiration for Ross, having watched several of his broadcasts and having developed a specific curiosity about the man behind such a consistently calm and consistently gentle public persona. This genuine curiosity, according to production staff who worked closely with Carson, reflected a broader pattern in his own approach to hosting, a specific and consistent interest in understanding the actual human beings behind carefully constructed public personas, rather than simply accepting those personas at face value. The taping began exactly as anticipated, Ross discussing his painting technique with the same soft, patient warmth that had made him beloved to millions of viewers, occasionally demonstrating small brushstrokes for the delighted studio audience. Nothing in these opening minutes suggested any indication of the profound personal revelation that would soon transform the entire tenor of the broadcast. Roughly 14 minutes into the conversation, Carson, with genuine and entirely innocent curiosity, asked Ross where his particular gentle demeanor had originally come from, wondering aloud whether it reflected his natural temperament or something he had specifically cultivated. Do not miss what happens next, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Bob Ross was quiet for a long moment, and several people present described a specific and unmistakable shift in his characteristically soft expression, something considerably more serious beginning to surface. He said that he had rarely discussed this particular part of his life publicly, and that something about the genuine curiosity in Carson's question made him feel, for the first time in any major broadcast appearance, that perhaps the moment had finally arrived to share it. He paused for a long moment before continuing, several people present noting the specific quality of his hesitation, a man visibly weighing decades of careful privacy against a genuine and newly formed conviction that the story finally deserved to be told. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a small, worn photograph, holding it for a long moment before showing it to Carson and the audience. It showed a considerably younger Ross, in full Air Force dress uniform, his expression stern and commanding, in a way that bore almost no resemblance to the gentle, soft-spoken man sitting on that stage. Several people present described the specific and genuinely startling visual contrast this photograph produced. The stern, commanding young man captured in the aged image bearing almost no discernible resemblance to the soft-spoken, gentle figure currently seated before them. A transformation so complete that several audience members later admitted they briefly wondered whether Ross was describing an entirely different person rather than his own earlier self. The photograph itself, worn and carefully preserved despite Ross's evident reluctance to discuss this period of his life publicly, suggested a specific and complicated relationship with this particular chapter of his history, neither fully rejected nor entirely embraced, but preserved nonetheless as an important, if difficult, part of his own personal history. He explained, for the first time in any public setting of this scale, that he had spent 20 years as a military drill sergeant, and that the entire soft-spoken persona audiences knew him for had been built deliberately and with considerable effort as a direct response to that difficult and demanding chapter of his life. Ross described, in a voice that briefly and startlingly dropped into something considerably closer to his old military bearing, exactly what those 20 years had required of him: the volume, the discipline, the specific hardness that the job had demanded he maintain every single day. This brief and unexpected vocal shift produced, according to several audience members, a genuinely startling moment that several people described as almost disorienting. Watching the same gentle voice that had spent the broadcast's opening minutes softly discussing brushwork suddenly and briefly demonstrate the considerably harder register that had once defined his entire professional identity. Several people present specifically noted that this brief demonstration, rather than undermining Ross's gentle public persona, actually reinforced it considerably, providing genuine and undeniable evidence of exactly how much deliberate effort and deliberate choice sustained the calm demeanor audiences had come to know and love. Then, just as quickly, his voice softened back into the familiar, gentle cadence audiences knew, and he said that this contrast was, in fact, the entire point, that he had spent 20 years being loud so that he could spend the rest of his life choosing, deliberately and consciously, to be gentle instead. This specific articulation, several people present later said, crystallized the entire broadcast's central message with a clarity that no amount of additional explanation could have improved upon. Johnny Carson, listening to this account with genuine and evident fascination, asked Ross whether he ever felt the pull of his old military bearing resurface, even now, so many years into his gentler second career. This particular question, according to production staff who observed the exchange, reflected Carson's own genuine and considerable curiosity rather than any predetermined interview structure, a specific moment of authentic conversational spontaneity that several people present later credited with producing some of the broadcast's most genuinely revealing content. Ross said that he did, occasionally, particularly under genuine stress, but that recognizing that pull had become, over the years, a specific reminder of exactly why he had made his original promise to himself, and exactly how much he valued the calmer version of himself he had worked so deliberately to become. He described specific strategies he had developed over the years for managing these occasional resurgences, deliberate breathing techniques, and specific moments of quiet reflection that allowed him to consciously choose his gentler response rather than defaulting back to the sharper instincts 2 decades of military training had originally ingrained into his automatic reactions. He said that this ongoing management represented, in his own understanding, not a failure of his transformation, but rather genuine evidence of its continued and deliberate maintenance, a specific choice he said he remade, in small ways, virtually every single day of his life since retiring from military service. The studio audience, 300 people who had come expecting a pleasant conversation about painting technique, sat in a silence that several people present described as the most genuinely surprised and most genuinely moved silence they experienced at any taping that year. Watching one of public television's gentlest and most beloved figures reveal the considerably harder man he had once been, and the specific, deliberate discipline required to leave that man behind. Several audience members, interviewed by entertainment reporters in the days following the broadcast, described the specific and unusual quality of this collective surprise, several noting that they had watched Ross's painting program regularly for years, developing a specific and comfortable assumption about his naturally gentle temperament that this revelation completely and permanently reshaped. One audience member specifically told a reporter that learning about Ross's military background gave her an entirely new appreciation for his patient teaching style, understanding, for the first time, that his famous encouragement toward viewers making mistakes reflected not simple natural kindness, but a specific and deliberate rejection of the harsh perfectionism his own military career had once required of him. What followed was a considerably longer and more candid conversation than anyone had anticipated. Ross discussing, with an openness he rarely displayed in any of his broadcast appearances, the specific psychological work involved in fundamentally reshaping his own temperament and the particular philosophy that had guided that transformation. That gentleness was not a natural gift some people simply possessed, but rather a deliberate and repeatable choice available to anyone willing to make it consistently, day after day, regardless of what came more naturally. Ross elaborated further on this specific philosophy, describing his own considerable skepticism, developed across years of personal reflection, toward the common cultural assumption that gentleness and kindness represented fixed personality traits that some fortunate individuals simply possessed, while others did not. He argued, with a specific conviction that several people present described as genuinely persuasive, that his own life represented direct and personal evidence against this assumption. A man who had spent 2 full decades being deliberately harsh and deliberately uncompromising, successfully transforming himself through sustained and conscious effort into one of the gentlest and most patient public figures in American television. He said that he hoped his own example might offer genuine encouragement to viewers who believed their own harsher tendencies were simply permanent and unchangeable aspects of who they fundamentally were. NBC's Switchboard received an overwhelming volume of calls in the days following the broadcast, viewers writing specifically to describe how deeply moved and how genuinely inspired they had been learning that Ross's famous gentleness was not simply an inherent personality trait, but a hard-won and deliberately cultivated choice, evidence that anyone, regardless of their past, could choose to become considerably softer and considerably kinder than their circumstances had originally shaped them to be. Several veterans specifically wrote in to describe their own difficult transitions from military discipline to civilian gentleness, finding genuine comfort and genuine guidance in Ross's specific example. One veteran, in a letter later shared with production staff, described his own considerable struggle transitioning from decades of military discipline into civilian family life, admitting genuine difficulty softening the harder communication patterns his own military service had ingrained into his relationships with his wife and children. He wrote that hearing Ross describe his own similar struggle and his own specific and sustained commitment to overcoming it gave him genuine hope and genuine practical direction for his own ongoing transition, evidence that this particular challenge, while genuinely difficult, was not insurmountable given sufficient commitment and sufficient time. This response, echoed across numerous similar letters NBC received in the following weeks, suggested that Ross's revelation had provided something considerably more valuable than simple entertainment content, a genuine and practical model for veterans navigating their own difficult transitions back into civilian gentleness. Bob Ross continued his beloved painting program for several more years following that broadcast, and he died on July 4, 1995, less than 2 years later, from complications related to lymphoma. In the time remaining to him following that broadcast, according to people close to him, Ross spoke more openly about his military background than he ever had previously, apparently finding a specific and considerable relief in no longer needing to carefully manage the boundary between his past and his present public identity. His obituaries across American media specifically referenced his 20 years of military service and the deliberate transformation that followed, several noting that this revelation, once it became more widely known following that Tonight Show broadcast, added a considerably deeper dimension to his already beloved public legacy, evidence that the calmest and gentlest voice on American television had, in fact, earned that gentleness through considerable and deliberate personal transformation, rather than simply being born with it. There is one final detail about this story that deserves to be understood, something that connects the entire arc of Ross's remarkable transformation back to what happened on that Tonight Show stage. Years after his death, when biographers and documentary filmmakers began examining the full scope of his considerable life and career for various retrospective projects, several specifically identified this particular broadcast as one of the most significant and most revealing pieces of evidence available about the actual psychological journey underlying his beloved public persona. One documentary filmmaker, examining Ross's complete life story, noted that the broadcast fundamentally reshaped public understanding of his gentleness, transforming it from an assumed natural trait into a genuinely inspiring example of deliberate personal transformation, evidence that even the most seemingly effortless and most seemingly natural public personas sometimes concealed decades of genuine and difficult internal work that audiences, watching only the polished final result, rarely had any opportunity to fully witness or fully understand. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to think about the specific and deliberate choices you might need to make to become the calmer, gentler version of yourself you actually want to be, regardless of what circumstances or past experiences originally shaped you into. That transformation, however difficult it may initially seem, is available to anyone genuinely willing to commit to it consistently. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that gentleness is a choice available to anyone, built through consistent practice rather than simply inherited from a naturally soft temperament. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories about the deliberate transformations behind America's most beloved public figures. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and telling me about a moment when you deliberately chose to become gentler than your circumstances had originally shaped you to be. That specific choice, made consistently and repeatedly, is very often the truest measure of genuine personal growth.